Once we have identified the cause of the disease, that is, the nodule of the psyche, the next thing is to formulate a treatment which, as you may have already inferred, depends on each situation. In general, for diseases of this type, the treatment phase usually focuses on a fundamental technique, which is psychic dissolution. In dissolution, what I do is help you separate the problem into its essential components. Let's assume you have a nodule that causes you a lot of pain and suffering. When we dissolve a nodule, I subject you to the sugar cube technique, which is something that the people who have worked with me are very aware of. It is a technique to which I ask you a series of questions so that the nodule begins to get rid of instantly. Imagine this as if your psyche were a kind of coffee in which too much sugar has been concentrated. Of course, it is something very difficult to taste. But when you start stirring that coffee with a spoon, the sugar cube begins to dissolve. Metaphorically speaking, of course. The same thing happens with what hurts you. Through the therapy process, I help you to dissolve the nodule that torments you, which allows you to savor it, in quotes, much more easily. As you will remember, the nodule is nothing other than the conflict that you are facing at this moment. A psychic conflict is something that limits you, that prevents you from moving forward in your life because a series of forces in your psyche are activated which prevent you from moving forward as you would like to. And based on all this, the question that arises is how we find this nodule of the psyche or conflict. To answer this, I want you to remember for a moment the real case that I told you about a while ago. As you may remember, my client did not want to get pregnant because in practice she wanted to work, but she was afraid that if she did, that is, if she followed her will and did not get pregnant, her husband would abandon her and her family would despise her. Maybe you don't see it yet, but if you look closely, you will realize that with just this phrase, we have already separated the problem into its fundamental components. Firstly, what my client did not want to do. In this case, as you can clearly see, it was the fact that she did not want to get pregnant. The second thing was to define what my client really wanted. In this case, she wanted to work. Do you notice that the conflict occurs here? Because the person does not want to do something because she wants something else, but she does not dare to do it because she fears that something will happen that will alter her emotional or social stability. In this case, the fear that arose in her was the fact that if she complied with her wishes, her husband could potentially abandon her, in addition to the fear that her entire family might speak ill of her. Therefore, when you want to recognize a nodule in your psyche so that the true conflict that you are facing and that perhaps you have not recognized or do not want to admit to yourself comes to light, what you must do is separate the problem into its essential components in order to proceed to dissolve it. Do you notice that it is the same thing that happens with the sugar cube? As you stir the coffee, the lump breaks down, that is, it separates into its essential components until it mixes almost completely with the coffee that you are tasting at that moment. In your case, you already have the recipe for it. When you face a problem, you must first define what you don't want to happen or what you don't want to do. Secondly, you must determine what you really want to do or have happen with your life. This, of course, depending on the first step. And thirdly, you must define why you are afraid to do what you want. Deep down, who subjects you to that state of fear? because if you comply with your desires, you're going to get hurt in the process. Let me give you an example so you can apply this to your own reality. What happens in the case of couple relationships? Usually, people are forced to comply with some condition imposed on them by their partner, something they don't like because they want to do something else with their time. But they do it precisely because of the fear of abandonment or the conflict that may arise in the middle of the relationship. I am referring to conflicts because these are always associated with words that hurt you. Although you may have already realized that these words are always associated with abandonment, and that causes the person to always limit themselves in terms of their true desires, which in turn generates that, with the passage of time, this person, who could perfectly be you, begins to somatize states of frustration or anxiety precisely because he does not live as he would like to. Now, how do we dissolve this noodle? Once we have separated the conflict into its essential components, the next thing we should do is stop that to having so much influence in your psyche. In the first case, I mean what you don't want to do, you must accept that the fact that you don't want to do something is not as terrible as others make you believe. You have the right for things to exist in the world that you don't like, even when you are in a relationship. Therefore, to dissolve this essential component, it is recommended that you first accept that you don't like that, the consciousness phase. Once we have defined what you don't like, I want you to take a moment to think about something that you don't like, but that apparently everyone else is fascinated by. In my case, football, soccer bores me a lot, but the majority of the world likes it. In my family, everyone likes soccer. If I give you this example, it is because I want you to think about your own situation. What is it that you don't like even though everyone around you seems to value it? The answer is that even when there's something that you don't like, the people who really appreciate you will continue to value you because they always have. What happens here is that you must teach people to respect your tastes and your limits because you are not an extension of them. Let's look at the second essential component. You want the opposite of what you force yourself to do. Therefore, the solution is obvious. You must learn to accept what you want and value it. Deep down, you have the right to make your desires come true, regardless of whether or not others value what you want. For the same reason, I want you to now do the opposite exercise to the previous one. I want you to project in your mind some desire that you have always had, but that is considered by most of the people around you as something eccentric. If you notice, here it is about accepting what you like. In my case, I always wanted to learn to surf, but my family considered it ridiculous, especially when they saw me passing by with my surfboard. But if you look, at one point I just accepted what I liked and did it, beyond what others told me. And what about the third essential component, the one of fear? You already know that this fear is always activated because deep down, you fear that someone is going to hurt you for expressing your true desires. If you look closely, two themes arise here. On the one hand, you fear abandonment, but also the fact that someone will hurt you with their words, because that could make you despise yourself. To dissolve this noodle, we are going to use the following technique. I want you to project yourself totally alone, because I want you to learn to enjoy your loneliness. and abandonment. I want you to use your imagination and take yourself to the most beautiful place on the planet. The place where you would like to be because you know that there you are going to be totally happy. And above all, you are going to be completely calm. I am sure that just by thinking about this, you perceive a series of pleasant sensations that lead you to realize that, after all, loneliness is not as terrible as it might seem. When you have control of your life, because no one controls you. If you use these techniques that I have taught you here well, you will realize that you will be able to very easily resolve any emotional conflict that you experience in the future, with which you will recover the mobility of your psyche much more quickly, which is the purpose of psychic dissolution. In the next section, we are going to work on the issue of identifying the psychic organ that is damaged due to emotional trauma, which is the next phase of this healing process that we are working on here. I see you there.